Hi everyone. This week we will look at grading the evidence. As you become advanced practice nurses and look at studies and journal articles in relation to the care you are providing, how will you determine which ones are valid? How will you know if one is questionable or not worth following? It is important to do a quality review or critique of research articles that you read so that you know the value of the conclusions the author makes. The learning objectives for this week are given on this slide. You'll spend some time focusing on reliability of sources, primary and secondary sources, and the level of rigor involved in the data that they provide. We'll examine how to do a good critique or appraisal of an article, and talk about how different types of research can contribute to evidence-based practice. When you are evaluating research studies, it's important to think critically about the source you have chosen. Is it peer-reviewed? What is the expectation for rigor of the research? Is it a research journal or site, or more of a conventional clinical site? Use your critical thinking skills. Does the research sound plausible? You've all worked on research critiques, so use those skills whenever you read a new study. Have they addressed all the elements of a sound study for the methodology employed? Identify potential bias. We require presenters to disclose their potential bias. You will see disclaimers at the bottom of the first page of an article. For example, if the researcher works for the pharmaceutical company and claims that the new drug is a miracle. Your text gives you many things to think about regarding evaluating clinical trials and clinical judgment. Different types of research contribute specific pieces of the puzzle. For example, truly experimental research helps us prove cause and effect. So think about drug trials. Quasi-experimental research helps us determine correlations between variables. Not exactly cause and effect, but definitely a relationship. Case studies give us insight into clinical practice and decision making. Ethnographic research helps us identify specific beliefs and behaviors of a culture. Each is useful for a different purpose. One research study alone doesn't tell us much. Many together help us richly describe the problem or phenomena at hand. Research studies by themselves do not prove anything. Researchers give conclusions and may have strong, suggestive results. It's when we have many studies all suggesting similar outcomes that we develop a clinical practice or standard based on that evidence. This image depicts the evidence hierarchy of different research designs. You can see at the bottom expert opinion or case reports. While they have some value, they're not without bias. As you move up the pyramid, the rigor becomes stronger and stronger until you get to the very top and you see randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews. These are very rigorous studies where you combine many different clinical settings and a strong experimental design to show cause and effect in your research. When you're looking for answers to clinical questions, you want to search reliable data sources. Primary literature is reported directly from the author or researcher of a study, so they're talking about actual results. Secondary literature is reported by someone else, Lincoln and Guba as cited in Creswell. Compiled works are also considered secondary literature. They might also be called a white paper. It's a collection of current information on a topic. This is what you get when you search up to date. Think about publication bias as well. You want to determine if the author had any other motives, perhaps financial ties to a company or a grant or a journal. See the Walden webinar on evaluating online resources. While this presentation is given by Walden, our library has the same resources available, along with a research librarian who is very willing to help you find answers to your clinical questions. Many quality resources are available through the Clark University Library link. Often hospitals, network systems, and clinics have access to similar resources. As an advanced practice nurse, it is your job to stay current with the literature. You will always be reading and learning. CINAHL, Medline, and PubMed can all be accessed easily online or through EBSCOhost. The Cochrane Library is maintained by the Cochrane Collaborative, which is an international collaborative that works together to provide the best evidence for healthcare. They have a collection of databases that contain high-quality evidence designed to be of use in healthcare decision-making. The Joanna Briggs Institute is also an international collaborative involving nursing, medicine, and allied health researchers. It offers resources designed to meet the needs of service providers, health professionals, and consumers by connecting the best available international evidence to the point of care, a major resource in the field of evidence-based nursing. The Institute of Medicine publishes position papers and reports that influence how we provide health care in this nation. The AHRQ is involved in many of the patient safety initiatives that have come about. The National Guidelines Clearinghouse provides evidence-based clinical practice guidelines. The Clearinghouse also has expert commentaries on other resources. All of these have websites where you can access their information. The web addresses are in your textbooks and on the CD in the companion book. Gray literature includes program reports, policy briefs, conference reports, theses, dissertations, all of which are often a primary means of communicating results. For example, your final project will be bound and kept in our Clark Library. When you read an article or white paper, you will want to grade the evidence in a hierarchy that is commonly accepted among medical professionals. Level 1 data is strong and drawn from many resources. Level 2 through 4 data is strong but limited or single sources and less generalizable. Level 5 and 6 involve descriptive or qualitative studies. These are the beginning of the process, the idea stage. The strength of the evidence also makes a difference in your decision about the usefulness of a study to your practice. We've talked extensively in this class about quality. Evaluating quantity and consistency will give you an idea about how much data is available to answer the question. Is this the first study or the 50th? How generalizable are the results? All providers are trying to evaluate the usefulness of clinical data and recommendations. These are two examples of grading systems that are in place to help providers grade the evidence presented. The American Heart Association started publishing the grading of their CPR and advanced life support recommendations a few years ago. Many of the interventions we perform in critical care we do because we think they work, not because they've been proven effective. The AHA has started grading more of the collected and published data so that we know how effective the interventions are for patients. This is in part how the "you don't have to breathe for them" recommendation came into being for lay rescuers performing CPR. UpToDate has a grading system for the data they compile on the subjects you search. There are 2 links provided in Moodle for you. I know many providers continue to use UpToDate long after they've finished their education. Please do the tutorial regarding grading evidence on UpToDate so that you know how the authors arrive at their recommendations. Once you have identified your clinical issue and have gathered some relevant research and graded it, you will need to convince others to share your enthusiasm. You may involve them in gathering information about the proposed change. This is done much the same way as writing a research study. You need to create a vision and share it with staff. Help others see the need for the change. Engage them. You may do some type of clinical trial in your clinic, or you may adopt a new guideline or practice. Ask if there are any barriers to implementing the change. Do you lack the new equipment? Is there a lack of space that limits your ability to implement a new procedure? Do you need to provide education or an in-service before implementing? It's important to take small steps and have a good plan for communicating any new ideas or guidelines to staff. Help your staff and peers make the link between the new evidence-based practice guideline and the clinical outcome you're interested in. Whenever you try to implement something new or update a clinical practice guideline, you always have to ask, did it work? Did we achieve the outcome? Any change needs to be evaluated. You will need to quantify the impact of the intervention or change for the stakeholders. Was it worth the change? Is it cost effective? Are patients more satisfied? Are their lab values better? This week you will be asked to discuss your preferred sources for clinical information. I know I use several sources for information depending on what I'm looking for. If I'm looking for something to print for a patient, it's much different than if I'm looking for clinical information for a professional or for myself. If I'm looking for drug information, I might use a completely different source. It's important for you to develop a list of sources that you can trust as your go-to list as you begin to do more clinical. You will need to teach your patients how to be careful consumers of healthcare information. Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's accurate. You will want trusted sources for clinical decision-making. And those sources will be different from the ones you will consult to research a practice change, or maybe even start a clinical trial of your own. So be thoughtful, discerning healthcare providers and teach your patients how to do that as well. Each method has specific elements that must be met. There are subtypes within quantitative and qualitative research. It is important to note how studies achieve results. Did the researcher account for the elements of the research design? Did the researcher overlook a key component? What are the limitations? How was the data analyzed? Quantitative studies are typically pre-experimental, quasi-experimental, or experimental in design, while qualitative studies might use a phenomenologic, ethnographic, historical, grounded theory, or case study approach. You must identify clearly what you plan to do and why the plan is appropriate for answering your research question. I strongly encourage you to keep your projects simple and straightforward. Quantitative studies typically use probability or non-probability samples and rely on numerical and statistical data collection. Their samples are very large. Quantitative studies with probability samples are stronger than non-probability samples. Probability samples include simple random sampling, stratified random sampling, cluster sampling, or systematic random sampling. Non-probability studies involve convenience samples or quota sampling, purposive sampling, or snowball sampling. When we look at qualitative studies, the focus is on a bigger issue, an overarching question, and the researcher attempts to describe a situation or a phenomenon. There are no simple rules for qualitative sampling, but the sample is usually smaller and more involved than for quantitative studies. The researcher must spend time with the people that they are interviewing or gathering data from in a qualitative sample. A qualitative researcher might employ convenience sampling, snowball sampling, purposive sampling, or theoretical sampling. Your textbooks discuss validity and reliability in depth for both quantitative and qualitative designs. The theory of validity and reliability is a little bit different for each design feature. Quantitative studies focus on accurate measurements and statistics, while qualitative studies
Focus on the quality and the trustworthiness of the data.